They mocked the veteran's crazy round cabin until the tornado bent its path to avoid it. When Caleb Dawson and his loyal dog Brutus built a perfect circle cabin deep in Absaroka Valley, neighbors laughed, calling it a broken soldier's foolish idea. But the night the sky turned green and the earth began to roar, the truth hit harder than the storm itself. Before we begin, comment below and tell me, where are you watching from? The bus groaned as it climbed the final stretch into Absaroka Valley, its headlights brushing across empty fields and the faint silhouettes of distant ridgelines. Caleb Dawson sat in the last row, his broad shoulders slightly hunched, his hands clasped together as if trying to hold still a world that wouldn't stop shaking inside him. The ride had been quiet, too quiet, and every sudden bump in the road made him tense. Old instincts, old ghosts, things he had carried home whether he wanted to or not. Brutus lay at his feet, his massive frame stretched along the aisle, his amber eyes watching Caleb the way only a dog who had shared danger could watch a man. The German shepherd rose slightly whenever the bus slowed, his ears pointed, ready for command even now. Caleb exhaled, resting a hand on the dog's neck. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "We're almost there." Brutus's tail thumped once, slow and steady, as if to remind him they weren't facing this new world alone. The bus finally hissed to a stop at the crossroads where the road turned to gravel and civilization faded into timberland. The driver gave Caleb a respectful nod, the kind people offered when they saw the old duffel bag, the service jacket, and the scars he didn't try to hide. "Good luck out there," the man said quietly. Caleb gave a stiff smile, slinging the bag over his shoulder. "Yeah," he said. "You too." Brutus trotted off ahead of him, pausing only to check the wind before leading the way. Absaroka Valley opened like an empty canvas beneath a sky dusted with the last light of day. Pines swayed under the whisper of a cold Montana breeze. Snow still clung to the shadows, even though spring was near. The land was wide, unbothered, almost untouched, exactly what Caleb needed. Noise in the cities rattled him. Crowds made him sweat. Doors slamming behind him snapped his mind back to places he wished he could forget. But here was quiet. A quiet that didn't judge. He followed the narrow dirt path toward the property his father had left him. A 10-acre plot tucked between the tree line and a sloping meadow. Caleb had barely spoken to his father in the last years of service, not because of anger, but because distance came easy for men who never learned how to say the things that mattered. Still, his father had kept the land for him. A safe place. A place to come home to, if home was something Caleb could still claim. The old fence post marked the corner of the property. Caleb brushed snow off the top rail, tracing the initials carved there decades ago. D. D for Douglas Dawson. He swallowed hard. Brutus nudged his leg gently, sensing the shift inside him. "I'm all right," Caleb whispered, though he wasn't sure it was true. Ahead stood the remnants of the Dawson cabin, just a collapsed roofline and a stone hearth that had survived Montana winters longer than anyone could remember. The structure had fallen apart while Caleb was overseas. Nobody came up here much. Storms and time had been the only visitors. Caleb stepped through what used to be the front doorway, his boots crunching over broken boards and patches of ice. Brutus padded beside him, sniffing every corner. "This is it," Caleb said. His voice echoed strangely in the open air. "Our new start." But the words felt heavy. He didn't feel new. He felt frayed, stitched together by years of sand, gunpowder, and the weight of names he could still recite in order of the days they fell. Nights overseas had been sharp, deadly, loud. Nights back home were somehow worse. Echoes that didn't fade, flickers of movement in the dark that sent his pulse spiraling. Sometimes he woke choking on air, certain he still heard someone calling for help. Brutus had saved him from that darkness more times than he could count. The dog nudged him awake during nightmares, pressed against him when his mind slipped into the past, and stayed alert through episodes Caleb hated to remember. If not for Brutus, he might never have left the service alive, or ever come home. Caleb pushed aside a fallen beam and knelt to clear debris from the stone hearth. His father used to sit here on winter nights, boots up on the ledge, telling stories about grizzlies that wandered too close, or blizzards so fierce they rattled dishes in the cupboard. Caleb could almost hear his voice again, soft, steady, comforting in the way only a man who belonged to the land could be. A deep loneliness rolled through him, slow and dark. He didn't fight it. He was too tired to fight anything anymore. Brutus leaned against him, warm and solid. Caleb rested his forehead against the dog's. "I know," he murmured, "one step at a time." The sun slipped behind the ridges, painting the valley in muted blue. Caleb unpacked the basics: bedroll, small stove, the dented metal bowl Brutus had used since deployment. He lit a flame and watched it flicker. The first night was always the hardest. Change had a way of stirring every buried fear. But as the quiet settled in, real quiet, not the heavy silence of barracks or hospital walls, Caleb felt something loosen in his chest, something just barely like peace. The wind outside hummed through the treetops. Snow cracked softly as it shifted. A hawk cried somewhere beyond the ridge. This valley didn't care about his nightmares. It didn't care that he jolted awake at every sharp sound, or that he jumped when a log snapped in the fire. It didn't care that crowds made him sweat, or that sudden shadows made his heart race. The land wasn't watching him. It wasn't judging him. And after so many years, that was enough. Brutus curled beside him as the fire warmed the fallen walls. Caleb stared at the night sky through the missing roof, tracing constellations he used to memorize during long deployments. A star fell across the darkness, quiet, brief, unbothered. "Tomorrow," he whispered to Brutus, "we'll start rebuilding." The dog's ear twitched. Caleb closed his eyes. For the first time in months, sleep found him gently. Morning came cold and colorless, the kind of Montana dawn that crept across the valley like someone dragging a gray curtain over the earth. Caleb woke in the half-light, stiff from the hard ground, but with a strange sense of being anchored. Brutus stretched beside him, paws pushed forward, jaw cracking open in a long yawn before shaking off the night's chill. The dog nudged Caleb's shoulder as if to say, "Up, we've got work to do." Caleb rose slowly, rubbing his hands together to bring warmth back into his fingers. The valley was quiet, except for the distant trickle of the creek and the icy whistle of wind weaving through broken beams of the old cabin. He stepped outside, inhaling crisp air that burned pleasantly in his lungs. Snow still clung to the edges of the meadow, but the sky hinted at clearer days ahead. "All right, boy," he murmured to Brutus. "Let's get supplies." They followed the narrow dirt path back toward town, boots crunching on frozen ground. Brutus trotted ahead, always scouting, always listening. Caleb found comfort in the dog's presence. Steady, loyal, alert. No matter how unpredictable the world had become in his mind, Brutus remained a constant. It took nearly an hour to reach the small general store on the edge of the valley. A wooden sign creaked overhead. "Thompson's Goods, since 1948. Caleb paused, steadying his breath. He had faced firefights, mortar blasts, ambushes in hostile deserts. Yet the thought of stepping into a room full of strangers made his stomach tighten. Brutus sensed the shift, circling back to Caleb's side. The dog pressed against his leg, grounding him. "I know," Caleb whispered. "We'll just get what we need." He pushed open the door. A small bell jingled overhead. The warmth inside felt unfamiliar. Shelves lined with canned goods, tools, and winter clothing filled the room. A coffee pot steamed on the counter. And he's calm unless he senses trouble. One of the men in the aisle snorted under his breath, muttering something that sounded like, "Looks like trouble to me." Caleb ignored it. He kept his focus on Earl. Just need some basics: saw blades, nails, rope, and maybe coffee. Earl leaned forward, studying him with a kind of wary curiosity. "Heard you were coming back. Folks said you'd been through a lot." The hesitation wasn't subtle. Caleb swallowed the irritation rising in his chest. "Just here to rebuild my place," he said. "That's all." Earl nodded slowly, but didn't look convinced. "Well, this valley's quiet. People like it that way. Your daddy kept to himself, too." From the aisle, the other man added, "Maybe too much." His friend chuckled. Brutus tensed, muscles tightening under his coat. Caleb placed a calming hand on the dog's neck. "Easy." He walked the aisles, gathering what he needed, but the murmurs trailed him like shadows. "Did you see his eyes? He's got that 1,000-yard stare. Hope he ain't the type to snap." Every word struck like a pebble tossed into a pond. Small, but enough to send ripples through him. Caleb had grown accustomed to stares in airports, on sidewalks, in waiting rooms. But something about being back in Montana, his father's land, his childhood soil, made the judgment feel sharper, more personal. Brutus sensed it too. His ears stayed pinned forward, body tense, tail low but firm. The dog positioned himself between Caleb and the men, shifting subtly with every movement. "Let him be," Earl finally said, firm enough to silence the whispers. "Man's just trying to buy supplies." Caleb appreciated the words, though Earl's tone wasn't protective, only practical. At the counter, Earl tallied the items. "If you're building something out there, you'll need more than this." "I'll come back," Caleb replied. "You'd do better hiring help." "I can handle it." Earl raised a brow. "That's so." Caleb forced his jaw to unclench. "I didn't come here to cause trouble, Mr. Thompson." Earl slid the bag across the counter. "Didn't say you would, but folks talk. That's all." Outside, Caleb exhaled hard, the cold air clearing the tightness in his chest. Brutus walked beside him, giving a low whine. "I know, buddy," Caleb said softly. "Feels like we don't belong." "Not yet." They made their way back up the trail. The valley, with its wide-open silence and its endless sky, felt more forgiving than the people who lived beneath it. Caleb wasn't angry. Not yet. just tired. Tired of the way strangers stared at him like he was broken glass. By midday, clouds gathered again, rolling over the mountains like slow-moving giants. Caleb reached the property and set down the supplies. Brutus scanned the perimeter, nose to the wind, tail still stiff from the tension in town. Caleb watched the tree line, the shifting gray sky, the ruins of his father's cabin. "We'll rebuild," he said quietly. "Our way." Brutus came to sit at his side, pressing against him with quiet certainty. In that moment, the valley didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like the first fragile thread of belonging. Thin, uncertain, but real. And despite everything that had happened in town, Caleb felt something stir inside him. Determination. Resolve. A whisper of strength waking up after a long sleep. "Let them stare," he murmured, patting Brutus's head. "We're staying." Brutus lifted his chin, as if agreeing. The wind rustled through the pines, carrying with it the faintest promise that everything was only just beginning. The next morning, the valley woke under a pale gold sunrise, spilling light across the meadow like warm honey, melting the last patches of frost. Caleb stood in the clearing with a measuring tape in hand and a quiet determination settling over him like armor. Today was the day he would begin building. Not just a cabin, but a place that might give him back some piece of himself. Brutus paced nearby, nose low to the ground, tail flicking with curiosity at the scent of elk and old pine. Every few steps he glanced back at Caleb, making sure the man he had followed through deserts and hellish nights was still within reach. "All right, buddy," Caleb murmured. "Let's draw the circle." He found the center point of the foundation, an old stone marker his father had once placed, and tied a thick rope to it. At the other end, he mounted a stick in the ground to act like a compass arm. He tightened the rope, walked the radius, and slowly carved a perfect curve into the cold earth. A full circle, 24 feet across. A shape that had saved lives overseas. A shape that spread blast pressure evenly instead of letting it tear through angles and corners. A shape that felt safe. Brutus walked the circle with him, sniffing the path Caleb carved, occasionally pawing at the dirt as if helping define the boundary of their future shelter. Caleb smiled. "That's right. This'll be home." By midday, he had marked the placement of the first logs, thick rounds of weathered pine he'd hauled from the tree line. His shoulders strained, but the work felt honest, grounding. Each log he set down, each notch he carved brought a steady beat to his chest, something like rhythm returning to a man who had lived too long in chaos. But the peace didn't last. It began with the crunch of tires over gravel. Brutus froze, ears pointed toward the trail. Caleb straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow as Earl Thompson's old pickup rolled into view. The same two men from the general store sat crammed inside the cab. Of course they came. Earl stepped out, boots thudding onto the dirt, arms crossed against the chill. "Heard you were building something out here," he said flatly. "Just getting started," Caleb replied. The other men circled the clearing, kicking at logs, muttering under their breath. One of them, the shorter, bald one, pointed at the round outline carved in the dirt. "What's that supposed to be? A corral? A water tank?" Caleb forced a breath through his nose. "It's a cabin." "A cabin?" The taller man barked a laugh. "Cabins are square, son." Brutus moved between them and Caleb, posture tall, gaze fixed. The muscles along his back rippled with tension. Earl studied the circle, squinting in disbelief. "You planning to live inside a wooden donut?" Caleb kept his voice steady. "Round structures are stronger in high wind. Better load distribution. No corners for the force to grab." The bald man snorted. Sounds like military nonsense. Caleb felt his jaw tighten, memories sparking behind his eyes. Sandstorms slamming into circular bunkers that stayed standing while square ones failed. He forced those images back into their box. It works, he said quietly. Earl tilted his head. Son, I've built barns and sheds for 35 years. I ain't never seen a round cabin up here. Snow'll break the roof. Wind'll twist it. You're building a coffin. Brutus growled low, a warning rumble. Easy, Caleb whispered, calming the dog with a hand. Nobody's here to fight. That dog looks like he wants to, the bald man muttered, stepping back. He's trained, Caleb said. He only reacts when he senses aggression. Or crazy, the tall man added under his breath. The words hit harder than Caleb expected. Maybe because they echoed ones he'd heard in hospital halls, from strangers who thought broken minds looked a certain way. Maybe because he feared, more than anything, that parts of them were right. But he swallowed it down. I'm fine. Earl shook his head. Town's talking, you know. PTSD, living out here alone. Now this. He gestured at the circle. People think you ought to rethink things. Caleb lifted the first log onto its foundation stones, setting it firmly. The thud echoed through the clearing. I'm building it, he said simply. His voice didn't waver. Earl looked at the log, then at Caleb, then at Brutus. Something unreadable flickered in his expression. Pity, challenge, maybe both. Finally, he sighed. Fine, but don't say nobody warned you. He climbed back into his truck. As the pickup rumbled away, Brutus stayed stiff, watching until the dust settled. Caleb knelt beside him, placing a steady hand on the dog's back. It's just talk, he whispered, though his voice carried the weight of old fractures. We've been through worse. Brutus pressed his forehead to Caleb's chest, grounding him. The afternoon stretched long as Caleb worked, lifting log after log, carving notches with practiced precision. Brutus stayed close, keeping watch as the first ring of wall slowly rose. Sunlight played across the curve, giving it a warm golden glow that made the clearing feel less like a forgotten spot in the mountains and more like the beginning of something real. By dusk, the wall stood chest high. Caleb stepped back, sweat stinging his eyes, and saw not just wood, but hope. A circular promise rising from broken ground. Brutus lay beside him, tail tapping softly against the dirt as if approving. But far across the valley, a thin line of smoke drifted upward from Earl Thompson's property. If Caleb listened closely, he could almost hear their voices on the wind, laughing, doubting, dismissing. It didn't matter. He lifted the last log of the day, placed it with care, and watched the circle tighten around him like a shield. Let them talk, he whispered into the falling night. We're doing this our way. Brutus stood and pressed against his leg, as if sealing the vow. Together, man and dog stood inside the rising walls, feeling, for the first time, the faint outline of a future strong enough to withstand whatever storms might come. The following days passed in a steady rhythm of labor. Dawn to dusk, Caleb carved notches, lifted heavy logs, checked measurements twice, sometimes 3 times. Work gave his hands purpose, his lungs air, and his mind something to hold on to besides the intrusive flashes that still surfaced when he least expected them. Brutus remained his silent partner, guardian, companion, shadow. The dog paced the perimeter, sniffing every gust of wind, alert to every distant rustle. By the end of the week, the circular wall stood nearly 7 feet high, just enough to give the cabin shape, just enough to make people stop and stare. And they did. Every afternoon, someone drove by, slowly, on the ridge road. Trucks rolled to a crawl, windows lowered, murmurs drifting down to the clearing. Sometimes laughter, sometimes pity. Sometimes the blunt disbelief of people who had already decided the world had only one right way to build a house. Caleb kept working anyway. On a cool afternoon, thick clouds rolled across the mountain peaks like bruises gathering in the sky. The air felt heavier that day, the kind of heavy that made birds quiet and made the hairs on the back of Brutus's neck rise. Caleb noticed it too, but he chalked it up to weather. Montana had moods, every resident knew that. But Brutus sensed something more. He froze suddenly near the north edge of the clearing, ears locked forward, his whole body stiffening the way he used to in the desert when he detected movement beyond a perimeter. A low growl built in his chest, not aggressive, not directed at Caleb, but instinctive. A warning. "What is it, boy?" Caleb asked, setting down his axe. Brutus took 2 steps forward, nose lifted, tasting the air. Wind shifted sharply around them, swirling in a fast, unnatural spiral before breaking apart. Caleb watched the movement of dust and pine needles twisting across the ground. Strange. The dog's growl deepened. He wasn't looking at animals. He wasn't tracking a scent. His focus was on the wind itself, its erratic, jagged behavior as it rushed down from the ridge, hit the rising circular wall, and curved sharply away. Caleb frowned, stepping beside him. "You feel that too?" A sudden, forceful gust slammed into the clearing. Brutus lunged forward, barking with urgency, spinning toward the wall of logs as if anticipating a threat that had no shape. Caleb shielded his eyes as debris scattered. And then, just as quickly, the gust split, curling cleanly around the cabin's curved structure and dissipating near the tree line. Caleb blinked, stunned. It was just like he remembered from overseas, how curved, reinforced bunkers had redirected shockwaves, how air currents bent when encountering round fortifications. But those were carefully engineered concrete shelters. This was a log cabin in Montana. Still, the physics didn't lie. Brutus turned to him, barking sharply once, as if to confirm what Caleb had already realized. "You picked up on that before I did," Caleb whispered, kneeling to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Smart boy." But the moment of quiet was broken by the crunch of tires along the ridge. Another truck. Another set of eyes. Another judgment. This time, it was Earl Thompson. He parked at the edge of the clearing and stepped out, boots hitting dirt with a disapproving thud. His face held the same pinched suspicion as before, but today his gaze flicked between the curved walls and the swirling dust still settling. "You seen the weather report?" Earl asked. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. "Just wind." "That wasn't normal wind." Earl gestured at the trees behind him. "Storm patterns have been odd this week. Folks are saying a big system's rolling in from Idaho. Don't know how long it'll hold." Brutus stood between them, eyes fixed on Earl like he was evaluating an unknown variable. Earl took a step back. "Dog's jumpy today." "Just cautious," Caleb replied. "He knows when something's off." Earl snorted. "Wind spooked your dog, huh? Maybe you ought to take that as a sign this project of yours ain't headed the right direction." Caleb didn't rise to the bait. He'd learned long ago that some people talked because silence made them uncomfortable. Others talked because silence made them think. I know what I'm building, Caleb said. And why. Earl folded his arms. Round walls, round roof, round foundation. This whole thing looks like a moon base. You sure you're not overthinking this? PTSD can twist a man's mind. Brutus growled softly, stepping closer to Caleb. Caleb's jaw tightened. Leave that out of it. Earl hesitated, not enough to apologize, but enough to change the subject. Folks are saying a storm's coming. Big one. You might want to rethink your design. I have, Caleb said. For years. Earl glanced at the walls again, shook his head, then climbed into his truck. Before leaving, he muttered through the open window. Storm season ain't forgiving. Hope you know what you're betting. The truck rumbled away. The clearing fell silent except for the wind slicing between the pines. Caleb knelt beside Brutus. Good boy, he whispered. You saw it before I did. Whatever's happening out here, I'm glad you're with me. Brutus pressed his forehead against Caleb's shoulder, another instinctive gesture of reassurance. Caleb stood and looked at the rising walls lit by the fading afternoon light. The air still hummed with the strange energy Brutus had sensed. A shift, a warning, a whisper only the wild understood. And despite the certainty Caleb felt in his design, a small seed of unease took root in his chest. Not fear, intuition. Something was changing in the valley, and Brutus, as always, had felt it first. That night, the wind carried an uneasiness that settled low in Caleb's bones. He tried to ignore it, tried to push through the familiar tightness in his chest as he cleaned his tools and stacked supplies for the next day's work. But the way the air shifted, fast, sharp, unpredictable, kept tugging at the back of his mind like an old warning he hadn't yet understood. Brutus wouldn't lie down. He paced the cabin floor, circling the small camp stove, ears lifted, tail held straight like a pointer. Every few minutes he stopped and stared toward the half-built wall of logs outside, the same direction the wind had torn through earlier. Easy, Caleb murmured. Just weather. But Brutus didn't believe that. His instincts rarely missed. By the time darkness swallowed the valley, the temperature had plummeted. Frost curled along the edges of Caleb's bedroll. The skeletal beams of the unfinished roof groaned in the cold. Brutus lay beside him, but refused to fully rest, opening his eyes whenever Caleb shifted. Caleb tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come softly this time. Instead, it dragged him back, hard and fast, into a desert night lit by a wall of fire. The thud of mortar shells shook the ground. Men shouted. Radios crackled. Somewhere behind him, someone screamed for cover. Caleb turned toward the flash, Brutus lunging ahead of him through smoke. Then another boom. Too close, too bright. He stumbled backward, breath ripped from his lungs, instincts firing. "Get down!" he shouted, grabbing for Brutus, except Brutus wasn't there. The smoke thickened. Shadows flickered. Something collapsed behind him with a deafening crash. Caleb threw himself sideways, trying to shield an image that wasn't real but felt real enough to break him. He didn't wake gently. He woke choking on air, eyes wide, heart slamming against his ribs. The half-built cabin loomed around him, dark and cold. But something very real was happening. A beam, loosened by wind and cold, had shifted above him. It groaned again, tilting, ready to fall. Brutus barked once, sharp and urgent, hurtling toward him. "Brutus!" The beam dropped. Brutus lunged, jaws snapping onto Caleb's jacket sleeve. The dog pulled, hard, dragging Caleb across the dirt floor with strength no one who'd never served with a canine would understand. Caleb rolled just as the beam crashed down exactly where he'd been lying. Dust exploded into the air. The whole frame shook. For a moment, Caleb lay frozen, chest heaving, disoriented between nightmare and reality. Brutus stood over him, body trembling with adrenaline, teeth bared at the fallen beam as if it were a living enemy. Only when Caleb reached out did Brutus turn toward him. "You saved me," Caleb whispered, voice shaking. But as he spoke, Caleb saw the way Brutus shifted his weight, favoring one leg. The dog whined softly, lowering his head. Caleb's stomach dropped. He pushed himself upright and reached for Brutus's shoulder. Under his fingers he felt heat, swelling, an injury. "No, no, no, no," Caleb murmured. "Not again, not you." Brutus licked his chin, trying to calm him, but the dog's breathing hitched. Caleb's hands trembled as he checked the leg. It wasn't broken, but it was a deep strain. Maybe a tear. Maybe worse. Flashbacks flickered behind Caleb's eyes. Hospital tents, medics shouting, the weight of men he couldn't save. But he steadied himself. "You're okay," he whispered, more to himself than the dog. "We're okay." He wrapped his jacket around Brutus to warm him and coaxed him to lie down. The dog rested his head on Caleb's thigh, tail giving a weak thump as if reassuring him. Caleb didn't sleep again. He sat beside Brutus all night, one hand stroking the dog's fur, the other gripping the edge of his bedroll whenever memories tried to drag him back under. By dawn, the nightmare haze had lifted, leaving behind only exhaustion and something heavier. Responsibility. Fear. A reminder that the valley wasn't the only place unpredictable. He walked outside, the morning light spilling across broken beams and scattered tools. The cold bite of the air cleared his thoughts, but the sight of the fallen timber made his heart clench. He could have died. If not for Brutus, he might have. Caleb pressed his palms against his eyes. "I thought coming here would make all that go away," he whispered into the empty clearing. "But I brought it with me." Brutus barked softly from inside the cabin, calling him back, refusing to let him drift too far into the darkness he tried to outrun. Caleb returned to the dog's side, kneeling so their faces were close. "I'm not losing you," he said, voice rough. "Not after everything." Brutus nudged his hand in quiet agreement. The sun climbed higher, warming the frost on the logs, thawing the bitter edge of the long night. Caleb sat with Brutus until the dog drifted into a deeper, calmer sleep. And as he watched the steady rise and fall of Brutus's chest, Caleb felt something shift inside him. The valley was still dangerous. The work ahead would still be brutal. But he wasn't alone. And in that fragile morning calm, he realized something else. Something he'd been trying not to admit. He needed this cabin. He needed this new beginning. He needed Brutus. Not as a tool, not as a soldier, but as the last lifeline tethering him to the world. A gust of wind swept through the clearing, bending around the curved walls like water around stone. Caleb looked up. Whatever storm was coming, he and Brutus would face it together. They always had. But the valley had its own storms, ones made not of wind and weather, but of people, suspicion, and the uneasy way small communities reacted to anything they didn't understand. Brutus slept most of the morning, his injured leg stretched out carefully on a folded blanket. Caleb checked the swelling every hour, gently pressing around the muscle the way the medics had taught him years ago. The dog winced, but didn't pull away. He trusted Caleb. Even in pain, he trusted him completely. "You rest," Caleb whispered, brushing his hand along the dog's neck. I'll handle the rest. But the rest came knocking sooner than expected. It started with the sound of engines, multiple engines. Caleb stepped out of the half-built cabin into the bright afternoon glare. 3 trucks idled at the edge of the clearing, dust swirling around their tires. Earl Thompson stood at the front, one hand hooked in his belt, expression tight. The other men, familiar faces from the general store, climbed out behind him. Brutus's bark thundered from inside the cabin, the kind of deep, commanding bark that once echoed across military compounds at night. The dog tried to stand, failed, then managed to push himself onto 3 legs, positioning between Caleb and the doorway. It's okay, Caleb said, though he kept one hand gently bracing the dog's chest. Easy, buddy. Earl lifted both palms in a half-hearted gesture of peace. We're not here to cause trouble. Caleb took a slow breath. Then why are there 3 trucks? The bald man from earlier spat into the dirt. Town meeting last night. Folks think this. He waved at the rising circular wall. This situation needs addressing. Situation, Caleb repeated. It's a house. Earl shifted uncomfortably. It's not the house people are worried about. It's you living out here alone. With your history. Caleb's fingers curled slightly against Brutus's fur. My history is none of your business. That's where you're wrong, Earl said, not unkindly, but firmly. This valley is close-knit. When one person does something risky, it affects everyone. A cabin like that, built without permits, without inspections, it's dangerous. It's not dangerous, Caleb replied. I know what I'm doing. The tall man snorted. Sure you do. Like last night when you damn near got crushed by your own roof. Sound carries, Dawson. Folks heard you screaming. Caleb's chest tightened. The nightmare. The fallen beam. The panic. He felt heat crawl up his neck. That was an accident. I fixed it. No, Earl said, stepping closer. You didn't. You survived because of your dog, and because luck was on your side. Brutus growled softly. Earl's tone hardened. We came to ask you, man to man, to stop. Take a break. Let someone who knows construction look at this. Or better yet, move into town until things settle. Caleb shook his head. No. No, the bald man barked. That's your answer? After almost dying? Caleb stood taller. I've handled worse. This is my land, my home. I'm not walking away. The men exchanged looks, some frustrated, others almost pitying. Earl sighed deeply, the sound of a man trying and failing to understand another man's choices. This isn't just about the cabin, Earl said. You're a soldier, Dawson, a wounded one. Folks worry you're not thinking straight. The words hit harder than any blow. PTSD. Wounded. Not thinking straight. Caleb swallowed the old bitterness rising up like bile. I'm fine. Are you? Earl asked gently. Brutus limped forward, placing himself fully between Caleb and the group. His ears were forward, his tail stiff, every muscle ready, even injured, to defend the man behind him. The tall man took a step back. That dog's gonna tear someone up one day. Caleb's eyes hardened. No, he protects. That's what he was trained to do. That's exactly the problem, the bald man snapped. You're treating this like a war zone. This is Montana, not Afghanistan. Silence cut across the clearing. A bird called somewhere in the tree line. The wind shifted. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Earl spoke again, softer this time. "We're not your enemy, son. We just don't want to see you get hurt. Or anyone else either." Caleb let the words settle. He heard the concern under the accusation, but he also heard the judgment, the doubt, the fear of what they didn't understand. He crouched beside Brutus, running a hand along the dog's neck, calming him, but also grounding himself. "I appreciate the visit," Caleb said quietly, "but I'm staying, and I'm finishing this cabin." Earl nodded once, slowly, resigned. "Then you'll be hearing from the county." Caleb lifted his chin. "So be it." The men returned to their trucks. Engines rumbled to life. Dust rose in swirling clouds as the vehicles rolled away, leaving Caleb and Brutus alone again in the wide, echoing valley. When the last engine faded into the distance, Caleb finally let out the breath he'd been holding. He knelt beside Brutus and rested his forehead against the dog's. "They don't get it," he whispered. "They don't understand what this place means to us." Brutus licked his hand, his warm breath steady against Caleb's palm. "I won't let them push us out," Caleb said. "Not after everything." The sun dipped behind the western ridge, casting long shadows across the circular wall of logs. Shadows that curled like fingers, reaching, warning, reminding him that storms came in many forms. Some from the sky, some from within, and some with human voices. But Caleb Dawson had survived worse. He looked out across the clearing, jaw set in quiet defiance. "No one," he murmured, "is going to take this home from us." Brutus gave a soft, affirming bark, and in the fading light of the Montana evening, man and dog stood united against a valley that still didn't understand them, yet was about to need them more than it ever knew. The next morning arrived strangely quiet. Not peaceful. Quiet in the way a deep forest pauses before a predator moves. Caleb felt it before he even opened his eyes. The air was heavy, the wind slow and unsettled, the birds scarce. Even the creek near the tree line sounded muted, as if something in the valley held its breath. Brutus rose stiffly from his bed inside the half-finished cabin. His injured leg trembled slightly, but the dog refused to show weakness. He limped to Caleb's side and pressed his head against the man's arm, urging him up, urging him alert. "All right, boy," Caleb whispered, rubbing the dog's ears. "I'm up." When he stepped outside, the sky over the Absaroka range looked wrong. A strange green tint washed through the clouds, deepening the shadows and turning the valley floor a muted, uneasy color. Caleb had seen skies like that before, once overseas before a sandstorm that swallowed the horizon. And years earlier, as a boy, before a tornado had scraped through a neighboring county. But this felt heavier. Brutus stiffened. He lifted his injured leg, balancing on three as he sniffed the air in fast, sharp breaths. His hackles lifted, not at a scent of danger nearby, but at something distant, coming, building. "You feel it too," Caleb murmured. "Something's shifting." He forced himself back to work, though his eyes kept drifting toward the sky. The circular walls now stood at full height, sturdy and interlocked like puzzle pieces. Caleb began framing the roof beams, using the same geometry he had trusted in hostile places. A conical shape, steep enough for snow to slide off, angled to let wind move over and around it. If the valley saw only strangeness, he saw survival. Brutus stayed near, watching each log Caleb lifted, each nail driven. But every so often, the dog paused, ears pinned, nose twitching, as the wind curled sharply around the wall in odd, spiraling patterns. The strange wind from earlier in the week had returned,
stronger now.
It collided with the circular structure and split, whipping around the clearing in swirling eddies that made dry leaves dance and dust shift in restless patterns. Caleb stopped working. "What is going on with this weather?" Brutus barked suddenly, short, urgent. Not fear, warning. A sound rose in the distance, faint but unmistakable. A rumble. Not thunder, not yet. Something broader, deeper, like the sky grinding its teeth. An engine revved near the ridge. Earl Thompson's truck descended the hill in a cloud of dust, swerving slightly on the uneven ground. He wasn't alone. His teenage son, Ryan, sat beside him, eyes wide as he stared out at the strange sky. Earl barely put the truck in park before stepping out. "Dawson!" he shouted, waving him over. "You need to hear this." Caleb walked to the truck, wiping sweat from his brow. "What's going on?" Earl held up a small battery radio, static fuzzing through the speaker, before a clipped voice cut through. "Storm front moving faster than expected. Residents advised to prepare for severe rotation. Conditions highly favorable for tornadic activity." Ryan swallowed hard. "Dad says we haven't seen a setup like this in years. Maybe decades." Earl nodded grimly. "Storm watchers are saying it could be a big one. Maybe a bad one." Caleb glanced at the sky again, reading the wind the way soldiers read terrain. "Feels unstable." "It is," Earl said. "And half the folks in town are scrambling. Some are clearing out early, heading south." He hesitated before adding, "Others are hoping you'll do the same." Caleb didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted back to the cabin, its curved walls, its strong shape, the vision he had held on to since the day he arrived. "I'm not leaving," he said softly. Ryan frowned. "But if a tornado comes through?" Caleb shook his head. "This structure is built to redirect wind. It's safer than people think." Earl looked torn between frustration and reluctant respect. "Maybe so, but it's untested, and you'll be up here alone." "No," Caleb said, lowering a hand to Brutus's head. "Not alone." Brutus's tail thumped once, slow but steady. Earl blew out a long breath. "You're a stubborn man, Dawson." Caleb offered a small, tired smile. "Comes with the job." Ryan suddenly flinched as a strong gust blasted through the clearing. It slammed into the curved wall and broke, splitting into two sharp currents that whipped around the cabin before rejoining in a chaotic spiral behind it. "What the?" Ryan whispered. "Did you see that?" Earl stared, dumbfounded. "Wind shouldn't move like that on flat ground." "It's not flat ground," Caleb said. "It's the structure. The shape forces the wind to bend." Earl studied the swirling dust and leaves. "That's unnatural." "No," Caleb corrected gently. "It's physics." Brutus barked again, this time backing away from the wind, limping toward the cabin door with urgency. The radio crackled again. "Rotation confirmed west of the Absaroka Valley. Residents should prepare to take shelter. Tornado watch extended." Earl shut off the radio, jaw tight. "This is getting worse by the hour. I'm heading back to board up the barn. You should think about—" "I'm staying," Caleb repeated. Earl stared at him for several long seconds, then nodded once. Acknowledgement. Worry. Resignation. Maybe a hint of respect. "All right," he said quietly. "But if you change your mind, our basement is open." Caleb dipped his head. "Thank you." Earl ruffled Ryan's shoulder, climbed back into the truck, and reversed down the trail, tires kicking up a haze of dust that swirled into the restless wind. Brutus limped toward Caleb, nudging his leg with a soft whine. I know, Caleb murmured, kneeling beside him. Something's coming. The sky darkened again, shade crawling across the valley floor like a living thing. The wind shifted, sharp, slicing through the clearing with a low moan that vibrated against the circular walls. The cabin withstood it, redirected it, bent it. But even as Caleb watched the wind curve away from the structure, a chill spread down his spine. "Storm's building," he whispered. Brutus pressed close, eyes fixed on the horizon. Together, they stood in the gathering gloom, the valley darkening around them, the air thick with the whisper of something massive forming in the distance. And for the first time since Caleb began building, fear, not doubt, but real fear, crept into the edge of his thoughts. Not fear of failure, not fear of judgment, fear of what the sky was preparing to unleash. The wind howled again, circling the cabin like a warning. Something was coming, and it was coming fast. By late afternoon, the sky over Absaroka Valley had twisted into a bruised palette of greens, purples, and heavy black clouds, swelling like a tide preparing to break. The temperature dropped sharply, the air thickening with that eerie stillness only storm-season veterans understood. To anyone else, it looked like weather. To Caleb, it looked like formation, something gathering strength the way hostile forces did before an assault. Brutus limped but refused to leave Caleb's side. His injured leg trembled, yet every instinct in his body screamed for him to protect, to warn, to stay vigilant. His ears twitched constantly, following distant rumbles that rolled across the valley floor like artillery echoes. The first siren wailed at 5:42 p.m. It rose from the town below, harsh, metallic, urgent, and cut through the thick air like a blade. Caleb froze mid-step, gripping the wooden frame of the conical roof. He hadn't heard that sound in years. Tornado sirens. The one warning everyone prayed they'd never hear. Brutus reacted instantly. The German shepherd lunged forward despite the pain, barking with sharp urgency, rotating toward the western ridge where a sheet of darkness pressed downward like a living wall. Caleb's heart pounded. Easy, boy, easy. But Brutus wasn't calming. He circled Caleb twice, barking toward the ridge, then toward the half-finished roof, his way of saying they needed shelter. Now. The wind hit next. It didn't build gradually. It arrived like a punch. Gusts slammed the clearing, whipping loose bark and dust into spirals. The circular wall of the cabin intercepted the blast, splitting the gusts and sending them skittering around the structure in two violent streams. Caleb watched it with a mixture of fear and grim validation. The design was working. But would it be enough? Lightning cracked across the sky, a white-hot vein slicing through the greenish clouds. Thunder followed seconds later, a deep, rolling boom that vibrated through Caleb's ribs. Another siren wailed, then another. A chorus of alarms echoing from the valley floor. He stepped inside the unfinished cabin, bracing the door frame while Brutus hobbled in behind him. The dog pressed close, panting hard, trembling, not from fear, but from awareness. The air itself felt wrong, swirling in unpredictable directions, lifting dust, tugging at Caleb's shirt, pushing then pulling as though undecided which way to tear. "What do you think, buddy?" Caleb whispered. "This it?" Brutus barked once, loud, urgent. Caleb swallowed, hard. A radio alert crackled from Earl's old station, barely audible over the wind. "Storm tracking east-northeast. Rotation confirmed. Multiple funnels forming. Absorb shelter immediately." The message dissolved into static. Wind roared again, this time catching the top of a felled pine outside and hurling it to the ground with a sickening crack. The earth vibrated beneath Caleb's boots. The valley moaned like a living creature in pain. He crouched beside Brutus, running a steady hand along the dog's back. "If this shelter fails, if I'm wrong." Brutus nudged his chest with his snout, stopping the words. The dog had trusted him through fire, through chaos, through battles darker than this sky. And now, even limping and injured, he was choosing to trust him again. Caleb forced himself to breathe, to focus. "Right. We hold the center." He guided Brutus to the safest point, the middle of the cabin, where the future hearth would stand. The thickest logs surrounded them in a near-perfect ring. The roof wasn't complete, but the beams formed a skeletal cone overhead, strong but flexible. The wind screamed, the cabin shook. Something, maybe a branch, maybe debris, hit the far wall with a shuddering thump. Caleb grabbed Brutus and pulled him close, wrapping both arms around the dog. Brutus pressed into him, giving a low, steady growl. Not fear, but defiance. Then, a sudden quiet. An unnatural, suffocating hush. The entire valley fell silent, as though someone had muted the world. Not even the wind dared move. Dust hung suspended in the air, floating in a stillness so complete it felt like standing inside a held breath. Caleb knew this silence. Every soldier did. The silence before impact. Brutus lifted his head, ears rigid, eyes wide, listening to a frequency Caleb could not hear. And then the roar came. Not thunder, not wind, a deep, primal roar that sounded like the earth splitting open. The tornado. It struck the ridge first, tearing through treetops, lifting entire pine trunks into the sky like sticks. Caleb glimpsed its monstrous shape through the open rafters. A swirling gray column, widening, thickening, drawing debris into its spiraling throat. It was coming for them. The wind slammed into the cabin with brutal force. Logs creaked. The doorframe bowed. Dust blasted sideways. Caleb shielded Brutus with his body, feeling the ground tremble beneath him. "Hold," he whispered into the dog's fur. "Just hold." The tornado roared closer, the pressure dropping so fast Caleb felt his ears pop. A deafening freight train howl engulfed the clearing, shaking every bone in his body. Brutus whimpered once, but didn't pull away. He pushed closer, burying his head into Caleb's chest. The cabin shuddered again. The roof beams rattled. But the curved walls redirected the wind in two violent streams that tore past both sides of the structure. Not into it, not through it, around it. The roar intensified. So close now, the ground itself vibrated like a drum. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut, gripping Brutus as the tornado's core shifted. Closer. Closer. Then, something strange happened. The pressure changed direction. The wind shifted angle. The monstrous roar drifted, not away, but aside. Caleb opened his eyes. Through the spinning dust and fractured light, he glimpsed the impossible. The funnel's trajectory bending slightly east, sliding past the clearing as if repelled by the cabin's shape, curving around them like water parting around a stone. He didn't know if it was physics, or luck, or something beyond either. He only knew the tornado had spared them. For now. He held Brutus tighter as the world continued to rage outside, the storm circling them with a fury that promised it was far from finished. But inside the circular walls, inside the heart of the structure Caleb had believed in when no one else did, they were still alive. The storm hadn't won. Not yet. But the valley was about to learn what real fury looked like. The tornado's edge scraped past the clearing, its roar shaking the earth so violently, Caleb felt the vibrations pulsing up through his knees. The circular walls groaned under pressure, flexing but not breaking. Brutus pressed himself deeper against Caleb, teeth gritted in a silent fight against the terror rattling the world outside. Then, without warning, the wind shifted again. A deafening crack split the air, followed by another, and Caleb realized the tornado had snapped full-grown pines at their base somewhere near the ridge. The entire valley moaned under the strain, a sound both ancient and terrifying. Dust choked the air. Shingles, branches, and unknown debris hurled past the rafters overhead like shrapnel. Caleb threw an arm over Brutus. "Stay with me, boy." The tornado reeled sideways, swinging like a massive, furious beast. It wasn't moving in a straight line. The storm was changing direction, being pulled by chaotic wind currents swirling unpredictably through the valley. It pivoted, dragged its churning mass, and suddenly began angling back toward them. "Oh God," Caleb whispered. Brutus barked, a single sharp sound, warning him that the world was no longer moving horizontally. It was twisting. The pressure dropped so sharply, Caleb's ears popped. He clamped his hands around Brutus's collar, grounding himself as the wind blasted through the exposed rafters. The noise was indescribable, like every freight train in Montana stacked on top of each other, screaming at once. The tornado lunged toward the cabin. The world went sideways. Wind tore through the clearing, grabbing at anything not bolted to the earth. The circular cabin shook violently, logs grinding against each other, dust raining down in fine, trembling sheets. Caleb forced his body over Brutus as debris exploded through the air. A shattered plank slammed into the inside wall, splintering inches from Caleb's head. He felt the vibration rattle through his bones. The tornado hit the far edge of the cabin's curved structure, but instead of ripping through the building, it slid along the log wall like a monstrous hand glancing off a shield. The entire structure groaned, leaning slightly, then springing back. The design was redirecting the force, just as Caleb hoped, just as he feared it might not. But not everything inside the cabin was secure. A roof beam, shaken loose earlier, rocked violently overhead. Caleb looked up just in time to see it tilt, slide, then drop, straight toward him. Brutus saw it first. The dog lunged, slamming into Caleb with all the strength left in his injured body. The impact knocked Caleb out of the beam's path by inches. The heavy timber crashed down where Caleb had just knelt, throwing dust and splinters into the air. "Brutus!" Caleb shouted, scrambling toward him. The dog whimpered, hit on his already injured side. He tried to stand, but his leg buckled. Caleb grabbed him, pulling him close as another blast of wind slammed the cabin. "You saved me," Caleb whispered hoarsely. "Again! You saved me again!" Brutus licked his arm weakly before collapsing against him. The tornado roared louder, closer, pulling at the earth with primal hunger. Caleb lifted his head and froze. Through the fractured rafters, he saw the funnel, now impossibly close, its swirling core rotating like a giant spine of gray and earth and flying debris. The storm's edges licked the treetops, shredding them in seconds. The valley beyond blurred into a churning hellscape. The tornado was passing directly beside them. But something astonishing was happening. As the funnel approached the clearing, it met the smooth, curved wall of the cabin, and its path bent. Not sharply, not unnaturally, but gradually, undeniably. Like water flowing around a boulder in a stream. "It's redirecting," Caleb whispered. It's actually redirecting. The wind split into two massive streams. One surged left, one surged right. Both wrapped around the house and rejoined on the far side. The funnel itself pivoted with that split, gliding around them rather than through them. Caleb held Brutus tighter, watching through the swirling chaos as the tornado skirted the edge of his property, only yards away, but moving past, like the cabin had carved a safe bubble in the storm's path. Then the tornado shifted again. It angled east, toward the valley homes, toward Earl Thompson's land. No, Caleb breathed. Not them. But he could do nothing. All he could do was cling to Brutus as the storm thundered past the cabin and hurtled down the slope toward the cluster of barns, homes, and acres of fencing Earl's family had tended for generations. Lightning flashed, illuminating the funnel tearing into Earl's property. Caleb saw something explode, likely the old barn, wood flying skyward like toothpicks. Roof shingles blasted off houses, tree trunks snapped like matchsticks. He could hear it, the devastation, even over the storm's roar. It took only seconds. Then the tornado lifted slightly, drifted, and began moving northeast, away from the valley entirely. The sudden absence of noise was startling. The roar diminished, the vibration faded. The wind calmed to a trembling murmur. And then, silence. Caleb fell against the dirt, pulling Brutus with him. His lungs burned, his muscles shook, and his clothes clung to him with sweat and dust. The circular cabin still stood, damaged, battered, but intact. Not a single log had buckled, not one had shattered. He stared at it through the dim haze, disbelief welling in his chest. "It worked," he whispered. "It actually worked." Brutus lay weakly beside him, chest rising shallowly. Caleb stroked the dog's head, voice breaking. "Hold on, buddy. Please, hold on." Outside, debris covered the valley floor. The air stank of sap, wet earth, and splintered timber. Pieces of roofs, furniture, and fencing littered the world like remnants of a battle. The world had indeed turned sideways. But inside the circle, man and dog were still alive. Because they faced the storm together. Because one trusted the other. Because Brutus, injured, exhausted, still chose to protect Caleb over his own safety. Caleb lowered his forehead to Brutus's. "You're my hero," he murmured. "You always have been." Brutus closed his eyes, breathing slow and ragged. Caleb held him closer as the valley lay in quiet ruin outside. The storm had passed, but the real reckoning was still ahead. For several long minutes, Caleb didn't dare move. The world was too quiet, wrongly quiet, like the cabin sat inside the eye of something that hadn't entirely gone. The air still vibrated faintly, the way it does after a massive blast, when the earth itself is trying to remember how to be still again. Dust drifted through the broken rafters, swirling in soft, eerie patterns that felt almost gentle after the violence that had just ripped through the valley. Caleb finally exhaled. His lungs burned. His hands shook as he pushed himself upright, pulling Brutus with him. "Easy, easy, buddy," he whispered. Brutus let out a weak groan. The dog's breathing was shallow, each rise of his chest smaller than the last. His fur was coated with dirt and debris. The injured leg trembled uncontrollably. Caleb's throat tightened. "You held on," he murmured. "You held on for me." But Brutus only blinked, exhausted beyond measure. Caleb scanned the cabin. The circular walls still stood strong, though they bore fresh scratches, missing bark and scars from airborne debris. A few roof beams hung crooked, but none had collapsed. The structure, this experiment everyone mocked, had held against something strong enough to level buildings miles wide. "Thank you," Caleb whispered to the walls, the design, the instinct that led him here. Then he looked outside. The world had changed. The moment he stepped out into the fading haze, he froze in place. The clearing, once peaceful, quiet, was a battlefield now. Trees lay snapped like twigs, stripped of branches. Chunks of earth had been scooped up and thrown aside. Fences were gone, scattered like matchsticks across the dirt. In the distance, he recognized a fragment of someone's roof caught in a bent pine. But the worst sight was farther down the valley. Earl Thompson's land. Even from this distance, Caleb could see it. The jagged remains of the barn, roofing material tangled in the bare limbs of fallen cottonwoods. Equipment scattered hundreds of yards from where it had once sat. A plume of dust still drifted upward, slowly settling into the wounded earth. Caleb's chest tightened. Whatever had happened down there, it had been bad. Brutus whimpered behind him, pulling Caleb's thoughts back to where they needed to be. "You're coming first," he said softly, stepping back inside the cabin. He found a blanket, laid it on the ground, and carefully lifted Brutus, all 70 pounds of muscle and loyalty, onto it. Brutus didn't fight him. He was too tired, too hurt. Caleb wrapped the dog gently, just enough to keep him warm. "We'll get you help," he whispered. "I promise." He gathered water, bandages, and a small flashlight. The valley was dimming fast, the sky shifting to that unnatural gray that follows a major storm. Quiet, empty, fragile. Caleb knelt, brushed debris off Brutus's fur, and pressed his forehead to the dog's. "You saved my life again," he said, voice cracking. "Just stay with me a little longer." Brutus's tail thumped once, weak but alive. A sound broke the silence, the crunch of tires fighting through debris. Caleb lifted his head sharply. Through the settling dust, headlights appeared, weaving slowly down the battered road. A familiar voice shouted from the truck's open window. "Dawson! Caleb!" Earl. The truck skidded to a stop. Earl jumped out, covered in dirt, shirt ripped at the sleeve. His hand shook as he grabbed Caleb's shoulders. "You alive?" he demanded breathlessly. "You two, are you alive?" Caleb nodded. "Barely. Brutus is hurt." Earl looked past him at the circular cabin. "I saw it. Saw the twister curve right around this place. I've never seen anything like it. Never." Caleb took a shaky breath. "Your property." Earl closed his eyes for a moment. "The barn's gone. House is damaged. But we're alive because we got underground in time." He looked Caleb straight in the eyes. "And maybe because the wind shifted when it hit your clearing." Caleb blinked, stunned. Earl continued, voice trembling. "It was coming straight for us. Dead on. Then it bent, like something forced it to move." His gaze drifted to the curve of the cabin's wall. "Your design did something to that storm. I don't know what, but it bought us seconds, maybe enough to survive." A knot formed in Caleb's throat. He didn't know what to say. He'd built this cabin to keep him and Brutus safe, not the valley. Earl took a step inside. When he saw Brutus lying on the blanket, his face softened. "He protected you again, didn't he?" Caleb nodded, voice breaking. "He always does." "Then let's get him help," Earl said. Doc Henry's already treating folks down at my place. He'll know what to do." They lifted Brutus together, slowly, carefully. Brutus whined, but didn't resist. Caleb held him close, whispering reassurances. As they crossed the clearing, Caleb cast one last glance at the circular walls glowing faintly in the storm-darkened dusk. Still standing, defiant, unbroken, unlike the rest of the valley. As Earl's truck rumbled down the battered road, Caleb held Brutus tightly in his arms. The dog's heartbeat was faint but present, a pulse of hope in the midst of destruction. Caleb whispered into his fur, "You stay alive, buddy. We're not done yet." And Brutus, loyal even in pain, pressed his nose weakly against Caleb's chest, answering the only way he could. He was fighting, and he wasn't giving up. Not while Caleb still needed him. Not while the valley's future hung in the fragile quiet after the storm. Earl's truck bounced over broken branches and churned up earth as it descended toward his property. The headlights swept across scenes that didn't feel real. Uprooted trees lying like fallen giants, mangled metal from cattle gates tossed into ditches, pieces of roofs scattered across fields. It looked less like Montana and more like a map of destruction sketched by a careless hand. Brutus lay in Caleb's arms on the passenger seat, wrapped gently in a torn flannel blanket. His breathing was shallow but steady. Every few minutes, Caleb whispered something to him, anything to keep the dog anchored. "You're doing good. Stay with me, boy. We're almost there." Brutus's eyes fluttered open, meeting Caleb's with a faint spark of the old fire. The same fire that had carried them through missions and darkness and long, sleepless patrols. Caleb stroked the dog's head, feeling an ache deeper than any pain he'd felt during his service. Earl pressed the truck harder. "Doc Henry's been patching folks up in my garage. Power's out all over town." As they approached the Thompson farmhouse, the full scale of the destruction came into view. Half the roof was peeled back like a sardine can lid. The barn was unrecognizable, reduced to twisted timbers and shattered boards. People moved across the yard with lanterns and flashlights, calling out to one another, gathering supplies, checking neighbors. The moment Earl's headlights swept onto the property, the crowd turned toward the truck. "That's Dawson!" someone shouted. "And he's got the dog!" People rushed forward. Caleb stepped out with Brutus carefully bundled in his arms. Concerned murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. "Is the dog alive? Poor thing. He got hurt protecting him." I saw their cabin from my window, I swear. The wind split around it. Doc Henry, a gray-bearded man with gentle eyes, hurried over. "Bring him inside." Caleb followed the doctor into the garage, which had been cleared to create a makeshift treatment space. A lantern flickered from a workbench, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Henry laid out clean towels and supplies with quick, practiced hands. "What happened to him?" the doctor asked. "He pushed me out of the way," Caleb said quietly. "Took the hit instead." Henry examined Brutus carefully. "Leg strain, bruising, maybe a torn muscle. He's hurting bad, but he's tough. He'll need rest. Real rest." Caleb exhaled, his shoulders sagging in relief. "Thank God." Henry looked at Caleb, really looked at him for the first time. His voice softened. "It's a blessing you two made it. Folks didn't think that cabin of yours would hold a stiff breeze, much less what hit us tonight." Caleb swallowed. "It stood." Henry nodded. "Words traveling fast." Before Caleb could reply, the garage door swung open. Earl and several neighbors crowded in, faces pale in the lantern light. They were shaken, tired, bruised, but alive. "Dawson," Earl said, his voice raw. "Tell him what you told me. About the wind bending. About the walls." Caleb didn't like the attention. Never had. But tonight wasn't about pride or proving someone wrong. The valley deserved to know the truth. He stepped forward. "The cabin's round. The wind can't hit it the way it hits flat structures. It diverts, splits, won't catch force the same way." The crowd murmured. One man, arms scraped and clothes torn, stepped closer. "I watched it." His voice cracked. "The tornado shifted. I swear it did. I saw it curve before it hit our barn." A woman nodded vigorously. "Same from our window. It changed direction right when it passed his ridge." Earl raised a hand for silence. "The truth is, Dawson's design might have bought us time. Maybe even saved lives." Caleb shook his head, uncomfortable. "I didn't build it for anyone but us." "But it helped us," the woman insisted, "whether you meant to or not." A teenager, Ryan, Earl's son, stood up from a crate he'd been sitting on. His eyes were wide, still full of shock.
"And I was watching too. I thought we were done for. Then," he hesitated. "Then it just slid away, like something pushed it." More murmurs, more nods. For the first time since coming back to Absaroka, Caleb didn't see suspicion or judgment in their eyes. He saw gratitude, respect, maybe even awe. Henry, still kneeling beside Brutus, said, "Wind behavior around circular structures isn't new, but nobody builds them around here. Maybe they should." Earl scratched his chin. "If we rebuild, maybe Dawson ought to show us how." Caleb blinked. "You want my help?" Earl met his eyes. "You built something that stood when nothing else did. We'd be fools not to listen now." Before Caleb could reply, Brutus let out a small, tired bark. A thin sound, but pointed. Everyone turned toward him.
The old veterinarian chuckled. "Even hurt, he wants the last word." The crowd eased into soft laughter. Exhausted, relieved laughter that came from surviving something they weren't sure they'd survive. It was the first warmth the room had felt since the storm. Henry stood. "He's stable for tonight. Rest will do the rest." Caleb knelt beside Brutus, his forehead touching the dog's. "Thank you," he whispered, "for staying, for fighting." Brutus gave a faint wag of his tail. As Caleb rose again, Earl placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. "We misjudged you, and that dog. I won't pretend we didn't." His voice cracked with sincerity. "But tonight, you two were the strongest thing in this whole valley." Caleb didn't know what to say. He'd never wanted recognition, never chased approval. The cabin wasn't meant to prove a point. It was meant to keep him alive. Keep Brutus alive. But now, maybe it would keep others alive too. In the garage filled with battered neighbors and flickering lanterns, a truth settled over the room. Quiet but undeniable. The valley needed Caleb. The valley needed Brutus. And tonight had made that clear. For the first time, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. Not because the world was safe again, but because he no longer felt alone in it. Morning arrived slowly, like the valley itself was unsure how to begin after a night that tore so much apart. A thin veil of fog hovered over Earl Thompson's property, softening the jagged edges of destruction. The air smelled of wet earth, splintered timber, and smoke from small fires neighbors lit to stay warm while repairing damages. Caleb woke stiffly from the chair he'd slept in, head resting against a stack of feed bags. Brutus lay beside him on layered blankets, breathing with more strength than the night before. The rise and fall of his chest looked steadier, The pain in his eyes dulled. "You're still fighting," Caleb whispered, his voice hushed and reverent. "Good boy." Brutus thumped his tail once, slow but certain. Doc Henry stepped into the garage carrying a thermos. "Coffee," he announced softly. "Stronger than my back, weaker than this mess outside." He handed Caleb a cup, then crouched to check Brutus's leg. "He'll heal," Henry finally said, rubbing the dog's forehead. "Might take some time, but he'll be walking normal again." Caleb exhaled the breath he'd been holding for hours. "Thank you." Henry shook his head. "Don't thank me, son. Thank him. He's got the heart of a warrior." "He always has," Caleb murmured. A knock sounded at the garage door. When Earl slid it open, nearly half the valley stood outside. Faces Caleb recognized, faces he didn't. Men with scraped arms, women with blankets draped over their shoulders, teenagers carrying boxes of supplies. They looked exhausted, shaken, but determined. And every one of them was here for Caleb. A murmur spread through the group, and someone stepped forward. A woman named Mary Ellis, whose home now stood without half a roof. Caleb stood awkwardly, unsure what to expect. Mary clasped her hands together. "We came to say thank you," she said, "for what you built, for what it did." A farmer named Carl added, "Storm trackers are saying the tornado changed direction right around your clearing. Without that, a lot more of us could have been gone." Earl nodded solemnly. "I told them what we saw, what I saw. The way that funnel bent like it hit a shield." Caleb shook his head, taken aback. "I didn't do any of that on purpose. You built something strong," Mary said gently. "Stronger than any of us understood. And it protected more than just you." Ryan stepped forward next, clutching a bent metal wind vane. "Dad says, maybe we should rebuild our barn rounded, like yours." More voices joined. "Could you show us how? Would you teach us? We don't want to repeat the past. We want to be ready." Caleb looked at them, these people who once whispered behind his back, judged him, feared him. Now they stared at him with something else entirely. Respect, hope, trust. He felt Brutus shift beside him, lifting his head. The dog's eyes, tired but alert, watched the gathering with a calm, knowing understanding. This was not the valley that had doubted them before. Something fundamental had changed. As the sun rose higher, pushing through the fog and spilling warm light across the clearing, Caleb stepped out of the garage. The crowd parted instinctively. Brutus, though still weak, tried to stand, and Caleb supported him gently. Caleb cleared his throat. "I came here to heal," he said, "to build something that made sense to me when nothing else did. I didn't plan to help anybody else. But if this storm proved anything, it's that we face things stronger than ourselves out here. And we're stronger when we face them together." The valley fell silent. "I'll help," he continued. "Anyone who wants to build safer, I'll teach. Anyone who wants to prepare, I'll lend a hand. None of us should feel helpless when the sky decides to turn." Earl stepped forward first and offered his hand. "Then let's start with my barn." Caleb shook it. The shake was firm, solid, equal. A cheer rippled through the crowd, not loud, but warm, heartfelt.
A sound of people who, for the first time since the storm, felt possibility instead of fear. Later that week, when the sun finally returned in full, the valley began rebuilding. Caleb walked from home to home, sketching circular layouts, explaining load distribution, and showing men with decades of carpentry under their belts why curves could sometimes save lives better than corners. Brutus followed him everywhere, limping less each day, his presence as grounding and reassuring as ever. Word spread beyond Absaroka Valley. A meteorologist visited, then a professor from Montana State University, reporters, architects, engineers. They interviewed Caleb beside the curved walls of his cabin, fascinated by how a design mocked by many had stood stronger than structures built by professionals.
But Caleb never took credit. It wasn't me, he always said. It was physics, and a dog who wouldn't let me give up. Brutus would sit proudly beside him, tail sweeping the dirt. Autumn arrived before the valley fully healed, painting the mountains in gold and copper. On a crisp morning, Caleb stood beside his now finished cabin, roof repaired, walls smoothed, every beam solid. Next to him, Brutus sat, finally strong enough to bear weight on his injured leg. A thin scar ran along his shoulder, a permanent reminder of the night he saved Caleb's life not once, but twice. Neighbors passed along the ridge, tipping their hats, waving. Not mockery, not suspicion. Recognition, respect, gratitude. Caleb rested a hand on Brutus's back. "We did all right," he murmured. Brutus lifted his chin, tail tapping softly. The dog looked out across the valley, at the rounded barns being built, the circular shelters rising behind homes, the community that had transformed because a veteran believed in something different when no one else did. Caleb took one last look at the place that had nearly taken everything from him, and given him everything he didn't know he needed. A home, a purpose, a place in the world again. And together, man and dog stepped onto the porch of the circular cabin, their cabin, as the sun climbed over the Absaroka range and lit the valley in a warm, forgiving glow. They had built something strong, something lasting, something that saved more than just themselves. As the gentle wind curved around the walls, almost reverent, Caleb whispered, "They laughed at us for building a circle." Brutus nudged his hand. "But the circle is what saved them." The valley, once doubtful, now changed, stood silent and grateful beneath the morning light. And the circular home, born from grief, built with faith, and proven by the storm, finally belonged to Caleb, to Brutus, and to the future of Absaroka Valley. If you've stayed with us to the end of this story, I'd love to know you're here. Drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments, just something small to let me know you made it. And if Caleb and Brutus's journey touched you today, make sure to subscribe and stay with us. There are many more stories of courage, loyalty, and hope on the way. Stories I can't wait to share with you. Your comment helps this community grow. Your subscription keeps these stories alive. I'll see you in the next one.